Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I rise to address this issue that the senator from South Dakota has been speaking on as well. I'm just extremely disappointed and frustrated, as the senator from South Dakota is, and many of us are, that 42 of our Democratic colleagues would choose to block the Senate from even being able to consider and having a vote, an up or down vote, on whether or not we should proceed with this incredibly important, in my view, extremely dangerous deal with Iran. Despite the fact, as has been observed, that 98 senators voted to create this very mechanism, a mechanism by which we could consider whether or not Congress wanted to pass a resolution of disapproval to prevent this dangerous deal from going forward. But they nevertheless subsequently voted not to allow this. And it is just mystifying. We know what the outcome would be. We know there is a bipartisan majority in the Senate that opposes the deal, as there is a bipartisan majority in the House that opposes the deal, as there is a bipartisan majority across America that oppose the deal. But somehow we have to, I guess, pretend that's not the case and avoid a vote that would clearly manifest that bipartisan majority here in the Senate, which, if we did have that vote and we passed the resolution of disapproval, it has passed the House, it would go to the president, and he would veto it. He's made that clear. And those of us who disapprove of this deal don't have enough votes to override the president's veto. So in the end, the president would still get his way, but somehow we have to hide from the fact that there is a clear bipartisan majority in both houses of Congress that reflects the wishes of the American people about this. So that's pretty frustrating and pretty surprising and strange that my Democratic colleagues who say they're all for this deal nevertheless are afraid to acknowledge where the consensus really is. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of the deal, but mostly, Mr. President, I want to talk about the context of entering into a deal with a regime like the Iranian regime. And there's a few things that I think we ought to bear in mind when we are entering into negotiations with any other country. But first and foremost, let's remember, this isn't an agreement with Switzerland. This is an agreement with Canada. This is an agreement with the regime in Iran. And the first point I would make about this regime is to remember how hostile they have been to the United States. 36 years ago, radical Islamists in Tehran overran the U.S. Embassy, stormed the compound, took 52 American hostages and held them for 444 days. And I would argue, Mr. President, that our relationship with Iran has not improved a whole lot since then. They're still holding American hostages today. They have killed over 500 American troops in Iraq and in Afghanistan. They regularly call for death to America. They call us the Great Satan. This is a very, very hostile regime indeed. The second point that we ought to keep in mind is the consistent, demonstrated aggressive nature and the regional ambitions of this regime. This is, after all, the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism. They actively support Hezbollah. They actively support the Assad regime as he massacres his own people. And when the government in Yemen was cooperating with the United States, cooperating with us in attacking and killing terrorists who were trying to kill Americans, well, the Iranian regime, during the midst of the negotiations, decided that that was unacceptable, so they essentially overthrew the government in Yemen and launched a civil war, which rages to this day. Of course, they continue to consistently threaten the very existence of Israel. That has been a consistent message from this regime. Third point I would make, how fundamentally untrustworthy this regime is. They're currently in violation of over 20 international agreements, and we think they're going to comply with this one? It escapes me why we think that that history isn't going to repeat itself, even during the negotiations. They were caught trying to buy nuclear parts. That is a violation of their own commitments. They were recently caught again using Hezbollah to supply arms to Assad in violation of agreements to which they've committed. Bottom line is very clear. This regime in Iran cannot be trusted. But maybe the fourth point that I want to make here is the most important in some ways. It seems to me, in my experience in business and in life, In order to successfully complete a deal of almost any kind, to reach an agreement, starts with a meeting of the minds. It starts with an agreement about a desired outcome, and that's true in business, in multinational organizations. It's true in negotiations we engage in here in Congress. The starting point is agreeing on a fundamental objective, and when two parties reach that agreement, then you can document it. You can draft the legal documents that then manifest and bring that agreement about. In my view, and I think this is a widely shared view, the Iranian regime has not decided to abandon the pursuit of nuclear weapons. And that makes all the difference in the world. I'll take a contrasting point that I think is worth thinking about, is the case of Muammar Gaddafi. Now, we can probably all agree that Muammar Gaddafi was a really bad guy, probably a human being with no redeeming qualities at all. But after the United States went into Iraq, and when our government presented him with the evidence we had about the Libyan weapon of mass destruction program, Muammar Gaddafi came to a conclusion. His conclusion was it was in his interest to abandon his pursuit of weapons of mass destruction because he was afraid of what we would do to him if he didn't. He didn't become a good guy, but he made a rational analysis of his situation and decided it was in his best interest. His ability to hold on to power was enhanced if he gave up those programs. And so he did. And we reached an agreement. It was documented. And there's every reason to believe that that would have succeeded because he had decided it was in his interest to make that agreement. Mr. President, I don't think the Iranian government has in any way come to the conclusion that they have to give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons. They've been at it for decades. And the very conditions that they insisted on in this agreement, in my view, make it clear that they have every intention of continuing to pursue nuclear weapons. So, to summarize these points, when you're dealing with a country that is extremely hostile to the United States and our allies, is aggressively seeking to dominate this region, has demonstrated by its actions that it's completely untrustworthy, and it shows no evidence of having actually decided to abandon the pursuit of nuclear weapons. Given those aspects, the reality that we face, it is very, very difficult to complete an acceptable negotiation to ensure that that country will be nuclear free. At a minimum, you would need an absolutely bulletproof, airtight agreement in order to be successful. Instead, what do we have? We have an agreement where we give many tens, maybe over $100 billion virtually upfront, which Iran will certainly use, at least in part, to fund their terrorist activities. The agreement allows them to retain an industrial-scale uranium enrichment program. You don't need any industrial or any uranium enrichment to have peaceful nuclear energy. There is a very dubious inspection and verification process which allows up to 24 days before inspectors can get to certain sites. The whole deal is temporary. After Iran gets its money, Iran can walk away from the deal with 35 days notice at any time. There's a little process they have to go through. That's 30 days long, and then they can give 35-day notice and just walk away. That's codified in the agreement. Of course, I think it's extremely dangerous for Israel and diminishes the ability of Israel to defend itself, and I think it's very likely to lead to nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East. So those are plenty of reasons, in my view, to oppose this deal. But, Mr. President, those are the parts that we know about. What's truly amazing, what's absolutely shocking to me, is that we don't have all the documents. I don't know how anyone can support a deal when they know they haven't seen some of the important documents that are part of the deal. But we know that's the case. There are two documents negotiated apparently between the IAEA, which is responsible for enforcement of essential parts of this agreement, and Iran, that not only has Congress not seen, the administration hasn't even seen. Secretary Kerry has not seen. Our negotiators haven't seen. Nobody has. And, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to have an additional 2 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. So it is shocking to me that we would proceed and that people would support an agreement when they know that there are essential parts of enforcement and discovery about the previous military dimensions that are unknown to us. But there's another point that I need to make, and I'll close with this, Mr. President. We had the minority leader, the Democratic leader was here last time we had this vote saying, this is over. You guys need to accept it, deal with it. This deal is going forward. There's nothing you can do about it. It's done. And, Mr. President, I want to strongly disagree with that. This is not over. We're not finished with this. And the reason we're not finished with this is because the President made a conscious decision. His decision was not to treat this as a treaty, not to respect the constitutional requirement to get 2/3 of the Senate to support this, which had he brought us in early on, we might very well have been able to get there. Instead, he decided to circumvent the Constitution, the Congress, the United States Senate, and the will of the American people. And so the result is, if the President goes forward with this, which it certainly looks as though he will, this deal will not be binding on the United States past this administration. That's by virtue of the decision the President made. He could have gone a different way, but he didn't. And so the deal can be undone by the next president, and with bipartisan majorities in both houses of Congress, that's entirely plausible. But there's another consideration, and that is that the President will be doing so in violation of the law. The law, the Corker-Cardin legislation, clearly and unambiguously requires the President to turn over all documents to Congress before the 60-day window even begins, and only after that is he permitted to lift the sanctions. But the President has not given all the documents to Congress. In fact, he hasn't even gotten all the documents himself. This is a clear, explicit violation of the law that we all passed. I know the administration says, but it's customary for the IAEA to enter into these secret negotiations. Well, as the senator from South Dakota indicated a little while ago, it's not at all clear that that is customary. But more importantly, that doesn't matter. The law of the United States of America is more important than whatever is customary between the IAEA and other parties. So, Mr. President, I think this is a very, very dangerous deal. I am very disappointed that we don't have a chance to have a clean up or down vote on this as we should have. But it's important for companies thinking about doing business with Iran and countries around the world to realize this is a deal between the current administration and Iran, and it does not necessarily succeed this administration. And number two, if the President goes ahead and lifts sanctions, he's doing it in violation of the law that he signed. This is not over, Mr. President, and we should not be giving up. I yield the floor.